Deep in the lush heartland of an ancient African kingdom, nestled between rolling green hills and a river that gleamed like liquid silver under the morning sun, there was a village called Umunachi. Umunachi was a prosperous place. The soil was rich. The rains came faithfully. Yam barns stood tall in every compound, and palm trees swayed heavy with fruit. The people were hardworking. From the first crow of the rooster to the last song of the evening crickets, the men and women of Umunachi labored. The farmers tilled, the hunters tracked, the weavers wove, the blacksmiths hammered, the fishermen cast their nets. Everyone had a purpose. Everyone had a contribution. Everyone except Obodo. Obodo was the only son of laziest, a once wealthy man who had spoiled the boy from the moment he drew his first breath. When other children were learning to set traps in the forest, Obodo was sitting under a shade tree, eating roasted plantains. When other young men were wrestling in the village square to build strength and character, Obodo was lying on a mat, calling for his mother to bring him another bowl of pounded yam. And oh, what a sight Obodo had become. He was enormous. His belly entered the room before he did. His cheeks were so full and round that his eyes seemed to be sinking into his own face. His arms were thick but had never lifted a hoe. His legs were strong but had never chased after game. When he walked, which was rare, the earth beneath him seemed to beg for mercy. The people of Umunachi had a saying about him: Obodo's shadow alone could feed a family, yet Obodo himself feeds on the labor of all. He woke each morning not with plans or ambitions, but with one single question on his lips. What is there to eat? Not, how can I help? Not, what can I build? Not, where am I needed? Just, what is there to eat? His aged mother, Adaku, would shuffle to the kitchen, her back bent from years of service to a son who gave nothing in return. She would prepare mountains of food: fufu with egusi soup thick with stockfish and bushmeat, jollof rice with fried goat, boiled yams with palm oil stew, roasted corn, fried akara, and Obodo would consume it all, every last morsel. Then he would belch so loudly that the chickens in the yard scattered in fear. And after eating, he would sleep. And after sleeping, he would eat again. This was Obodo's life: eating, sleeping, eating, sleeping. A circle with no beginning, no end, and no meaning. Now, for many seasons, the village tolerated Obodo. After all, his father, Mazi had once been a generous man who shared his wealth freely. The people respected the family name, even as they watched it crumble under the weight of Obodo's appetite. But then, the trouble began. Obodo's family farm, which had gone untended for years, produced nothing. The yam barns that his father had fed were now empty. The goats had been slaughtered one by one to feed Obodo's endless hunger. The chickens were gone. The palm wine had dried up. Adaku, his poor mother, had sold her coral beads, her wrappers, even her late husband's prized machete, all to buy food for a son who would not lift a finger. When there was nothing left in his own compound, Obodo began to look outward. He started visiting neighbors at mealtimes, not to greet them, not to help them, but to sit down uninvited and eat their food. He would waddle into Mazi Okafor's compound just as the family sat down to eat, and he would say with a wide, shameless smile, "Ah, my good neighbor, the smell of your wife's soup called me from my house. Surely you will not let a son of this village go hungry." And because the people of Umunachi were kind, and because custom demanded that no visitor be turned away from a meal, they would share. But Obodo did not eat like a guest. He ate like a plague. He would finish the entire pot, lick the ladle, and then ask if there was more. One by one, the families of Umunachi began to dread the sound of Obodo's heavy footsteps approaching their compounds. The children would whisper, "Mama, he is coming," and the mothers would hide the pots. The men would see his enormous shadow darkening their doorways and suddenly remember errands they had in distant farms. But Obodo was relentless. He moved from house to house, compound to compound, eating everything in his path, like a locust upon a field of millet. And still, he did nothing. The village chief, Igwe Okonkwo, a wise and patient man, called Obodo to his palace one afternoon. "Obodo," the chief said, his voice heavy with concern, "every man in this village contributes something. The farmer gives us food. The hunter gives us meat. The drummer gives us music. The storyteller gives us wisdom. Tell me, Obodo, what do you give?" Obodo scratched his belly thoughtfully, as if the question itself was a riddle he had never considered. Then he smiled and said, "I give the people someone to cook for, Igwe. Without me, their cooking would have no purpose." The elders gasped. The chief closed his eyes and shook his head. "Go home, Obodo," the chief whispered, "and may the ancestors open your eyes before it is too late." But Obodo did not hear the warning. He was already thinking about dinner. Then came the season that changed everything. The rains did not come. For the first time in living memory, the skies above Umunachi turned to copper. The sun blazed without mercy. The river that had always flowed like liquid silver shrank to a muddy trickle. The crops withered in the fields. The yam tendrils turned brown and curled into the cracked earth like the fingers of dying men. The palm trees drooped. The animals grew thin. Famine had come to Umunachi. Now, the hard-working people of the village had stored food for difficult times. They had dried fish, smoked meat, preserved grains, and fermented cassava hidden in their barns. They rationed carefully. They shared wisely. They tightened their wrappers and endured. But Obodo had stored nothing. He had preserved nothing. He had prepared for nothing. Because Obodo had never in his life thought about tomorrow, he lived only for the next meal, never considering that one day there might not be one. When his mother's kitchen finally held nothing but empty pots and cold ashes, Obodo felt something he had never truly felt before. Hunger, real hunger. Not the mild discomforts between meals that he used to complain about. No. This was the kind of hunger that claws at the belly like a trapped animal, the kind that makes the head spin and the vision blur, the kind that turns a man's own body into his enemy. Obodo went to his neighbors, but this time no one opened their doors. "We have nothing to spare, Obodo," said Mazi Okafor through his closed gate. "Our children are hungry." "Please," Obodo begged, and for the first time in his life, there was no smile on his face, just a small piece of cassava. Anything. "Where is your farm, Obodo?" Okafor asked quietly. "Where is your barn? Where is the food you should have grown with your own hands? You have 2 strong arms. You have 2 strong legs. Yet, you have nothing. That is not misfortune, Obodo. That is choice." The gate remained closed. Obodo went to the next compound, and the next, and the next. Every door was shut. Every face was turned away. Not out of cruelty. The people of Umunachi were not cruel, but out of necessity. They had only enough for their home families, and they could not carry a man who had never tried to carry himself. For 3 days, Obodo did not eat. His massive body, which had always been a source of strange pride for him, now became his burden. It required so much fuel to sustain, and there was none. He grew weak faster than the others. His legs, which had never walked to a farm, could barely carry him across his own compound. He lay on his mat, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in his entire life, Obodo was forced to think, not about food, about himself. "What have I done with my life?" he whispered to the empty room. What have I become? The silence that answered him was louder than any drumbeat he had ever heard. On the fourth night of his hunger, as Obodo lay between sleep and death, something extraordinary happened. The air in his hut grew cold, the darkness thickened, and then a light appeared. Not the light of a fire or a lamp, but a deep golden glow that seemed to come from the walls themselves. And in that light stood a figure. It was an old man, ancient beyond measure, with skin like carved mahogany, and eyes that held the light of 1,000 generations. He wore the white cloth of the ancestors, and around his neck hung a single cowrie shell that pulsed with quiet power. Obodo tried to sit up, but his body was too weak. He could only stare. Do you know who I am? The figure asked. His voice was like distant thunder rolling across the hills. Obodo shook his head slowly. I am Ezeaku the First, your grandfather's grandfather's grandfather. I am the one who founded this village with these 2 hands. I cleared the forest. I planted the first yam. I dug the first well. I built the first hut. Every good thing you see in Umunachi began with the sweat of my brow. Obodo's eyes widened. The ancestor continued, his voice sharpening like the edge of a blade. I have watched you, Obodo. From the land of the spirits, I have watched you with shame that burns hotter than any earthly fire. You carry my blood in your veins, yet you dishonor it with every breath you take. I built this village so that my descendants would thrive, not so that they would become parasites feeding on the labor of others. Forgive me, Obodo croaked, tears streaming down his swollen cheeks. I did not know. You did not want to know, the ancestor thundered, and the walls of the hut trembled. Every man is born with a gift, every man. The gods do not create useless beings. Even the smallest ant carries its weight. Even the worm turns the soil. But you, Obodo, you have buried your gift so deep beneath your laziness and your greed that even the spirits struggle to find it. The ancestor knelt beside Obodo, and his voice softened like the evening breeze. Listen to me carefully, child. I will give you one chance. One. When the sun rises tomorrow, you will go to the forest, to the place where the ancient Iroko tree stands at the crossroads of 3 paths. There, you will find a test waiting for you. If you pass, you will discover your purpose. If you fail, you will fade from this earth like a footprint in the rain, and no one will remember your name. But I am too weak, Obodo whispered. I cannot even stand. The ancestor placed his hand on Obodo's forehead, and the warmth flooded through the fat man's body. Not the warmth of food, but the warmth of something deeper. Something that had been dormant inside him for his entire life. You have always been strong enough, Obodo. You simply never had a reason to use your strength. Now you do. And with that, the ancestor vanished. The golden light faded. The cold retreated, and Obodo was alone again. But something had changed. For the first time in his life, Obodo was not thinking about food. He was thinking about tomorrow. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in his hut, Obodo rose. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. His body screamed in protest. Every joint ached. Every muscle burned. His empty belly twisted and cramped. But he stood. He wrapped his cloth around his waist, and he walked. The villagers who saw him that morning could not believe their eyes. Obodo, the man who never went anywhere unless food was involved, was walking toward the forest, slowly, painfully, but deliberately. He walked for what felt like an eternity, through the parched farmlands, through the thinning bush, into the deep forest where the ancient trees stood like cathedral pillars holding up the sky. And then he found it, the Iroko tree. It was the largest tree Obodo had ever seen. Its trunk was wider than 10 men, standing shoulder to shoulder. Its roots sprawled across the earth like the veins of the world itself. Its branches reached so high they seemed to scratch the face of heaven. At the base of the tree sat three objects: a hoe, a seed, and a clay pot of water. Beside them, carved into the bark of the tree, were words in the ancient script: "Feed others, and you will never be hungry again." Obodo stared at the objects. He stared at the words, and slowly, understanding began to dawn in his mind, like the sun breaking through storm clouds. The test was not a riddle. It was not a battle. It was not a trick. It was simple. Plant. Obodo picked up the hoe. It was heavy in his soft, uncalloused hands. He had never held one before. He gripped it awkwardly, raised it above his head, and brought it down into the dry, hard earth. Pain shot through his palms. Blisters formed instantly. The ground was stubborn, cracked, unyielding, but Obodo did not stop. He struck again, and again, and again. He dug into the earth with a fury and desperation he had never known. Sweat poured down his face and body in rivers. His breathing became ragged. His arms burned. His back screamed. But he kept going. He dug until there was a hole. He placed the seed inside. He poured the water from the clay pot over it. And then he collapsed beside the iroko tree, gasping, trembling, weeping. And then the impossible happened. The ground trembled. A green shoot burst from the earth. Not slowly, as plants normally grow, but rapidly, supernaturally, as if time itself had been compressed. The shoot became a vine. The vine spread across the ground in every direction, covering the cracked earth with lush green leaves. And from those vines grew yams, enormous, perfect yams, more than Obodo had ever seen in his life. But that was not all. From the spreading vines, other plants emerged: maize, cassava, vegetables of every kind. Fruit trees sprang up around the iroko, heavy with mangoes, oranges, and pears. The barren earth around the ancient tree transformed into a garden of impossible abundance. Obodo stared at what his own hands, had created, and he wept like a child. For the first time in his life, he had produced something. He had given instead of taken. He had planted instead of consumed. And it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Obodo did not eat a single yam from that miraculous garden. Not one. Instead, he gathered as many as he could carry. And for a man of his size, that was a great many. And he carried them back to the village. The people of Umunachi watched in stunned silence as Obodo, drenched in sweat, hands bleeding, body trembling with exhaustion, walked into the village square and laid the yams at the feet of the chief. For the village, Obodo said, his voice hoarse but steady, for everyone. Igwe Okonkwo stared at the yams. He stared at Obodo. He stared at Obodo's bleeding hands, and the old chief's eyes filled with tears. "Where did these come from?" the chief asked. "From the earth," Obodo replied, "and from my hands, for the first time, from my own hands." That evening, the village ate. Every family received a share. The children who had been crying from hunger laughed again. The mothers who had been rationing their last grain sang again. The elders who had been preparing for the worst offered prayers of gratitude. And Obodo ate last. He ate the smallest portion, and he said it was the greatest meal of his life. From that day forward, Obodo was a changed man. He returned to the enchanted garden every day. He worked the soil with his own hands. His palms grew hard with calluses. His body, once soft and purposeless, became strong with honest labor. He still had his great size, but now it was the size of a man who carried sacks of yams on his shoulders to feed his people, not the size of a man who sat idle while others labored. He became the greatest farmer Umunachi had ever known. His harvests were legendary, and he never, not once, for the rest of his long life, allowed another person in the village to go hungry. The people composed a new saying about him. Obodo, whose hands once knew only the spoon, now feeds the village with the hoe. And when Obodo finally passed from this world, old and beloved, the ancestors welcomed him with open arms. And Ezeaku I, his great ancestor, smiled and said, "You were always meant to be a provider, my son. You simply needed to learn that a man's purpose is not to fill his own belly, but to fill the bellies of others. Do not be Obodo before the famine. Be Obodo after. Find your hoe, plant your seed, feed your village, and your name will echo through the generations." This has been Ancestral Echoes. If this story stirred something in your spirit, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and return again, for the ancestors always have more to say.